Did Ignatius confirm the papacy less than a century after Christ? Today we are going to look at these incredibly early writings to see for ourselves. There has been a lot of debate surrounding Ignatius of Antioch, having written 7 epistles just after the 1st century in 107 AD. One of his epistles was specifically written to the Romans, that is, to the church that was located in Rome. This becomes pertinent to dialogues between Catholics and Protestants because both have used Ignatius to argue for and against the papacy. Now, why isn't it already a settled debate? We could assume that if there was zero controversy, then you couldn't read Ignatius's epistle without walking away a Catholic. But the reason why people have used Ignatius's writings both for and against the idea of the Pope isn't because his writing is ambiguous, but because it is surprisingly silent. In his letter to the Romans, he doesn't directly address anybody he calls the Pope or use any descriptors that could define the Pope's unique role. Therefore, as many have argued, because Ignatius doesn't emphatically address anybody we would recognize as a Pope, that must mean that Rome had no Pope within the 1st century of Christianity. Now, what do Catholics say? Mostly, this is a good case study of the argument from silence, or rather the fallacy from silence. Just because Ignatius doesn't emphatically describe a papal figure in his epistle, that doesn't prove that there wasn't a pope. However, even if this is brought up, the counter-argument to this would usually be to ask, why would Ignatius address a letter to Rome and not directly address any pope if a pope existed? There are actually a few reasons that could answer why. First off, it could be imaginable that someone could write a letter to the White House without directly addressing the president. Even if someone's letter doesn't mention a president, that doesn't prove that there wasn't one. I think that's simple enough. Although the second argument is more common among Catholics, and it makes even more sense. Ignatius was writing while in Roman custody, on his way to be martyred. The last thing he would want to do is start naming names, especially that of a pope, if one existed at the time. Now, someone might say he could still address the pope without naming him by name. However, taking it from his perspective, any mentioning of a papal figure at all in Rome could still be an endangerment to him. Therefore, that actually makes it quite plausible as for why he wouldn't get into major specifics that could paint a target in Rome's capital. Now, obviously, that is all very convenient, but I think that summarizes most of the debate on the argument of silence when it comes to Ignatius and the Pope. However, what if there is actually a positive argument that there was indeed a centralized bishop in Rome who is greater than all of the others, and that can be sourced from Ignatius's writings? By all means, I wouldn't be the first to propose this. I think there is some great work on this already. However, there are a couple things that I see constantly being missed on the Catholic side, and those are things we are going to get into today. So, how do Catholics argue for a pope from Ignatius's writings who doesn't explicitly mention a pope? It starts with Ignatius's opinions on the Church of Rome and his opinions on churches in general. We can see how highly Ignatius thinks of Rome in his epistle to them. He starts by saying, Ignatius, who is also called Theophorus, to the church which has obtained mercy, which also presides in the place of the region of the Romans, worthy of God, worthy of honor, worthy of the highest happiness, worthy of praise, worthy of obtaining her every desire, worthy of being deemed holy, and which presides over love, is named from Christ and from the Father. So clearly he believes that Rome is an ideal church, being worthy of honor and worthy of praise. This would make Rome a model for all other churches, given how he praises this church as opposed to all of the other churches he writes to. In addition, if we go to another one of his writings, we can see that he believes that all churches need a bishop. In like manner, let all reverence the deacons as an appointment of Jesus Christ, and the bishop as Jesus Christ, who is the Son of the Father, and the presbyters as the Sanhedrin of God and assembly of the apostles. Apart from these, there is no church. Therefore, if we put 2 and 2 together, that Rome is an ideal church worthy of praise and honor, and ideal churches always have a bishop, therefore we can conclude that there was a bishop in Rome. So clearly, apart from these, that is, deacons, a bishop, and presbyters, there is no church, in Ignatius's opinion. Now, that's the classic argument, but I believe that it is missing some elements that are being commonly overlooked. The main problem with this is how it doesn't satisfy the Protestant accusation. Since Catholics know that most Protestant churches don't believe in bishops, sometimes they assume that showing Ignatius's opinion on bishops will be enough to satisfy them, but this is not the case. Any Protestant who has read through any of the works of the Church Fathers know that they commonly talk about bishops. Still, this is not enough to convince them that holy orders is true, since they just interpret this as meaning overseers in general. We can even see the same term of episcopos in the Bible. Yet, not all Protestants believe in sacerdotal bishops. Therefore, they have a way of reinterpreting this. So if a Protestant were to read Ignatius about how every church should have a bishop, they would simply affirm that every church needs an overseer of some kind, not that this suddenly affirms apostolic succession. However, wouldn't that still mean that Ignatius's writings affirms the Pope? Sure, the unique attributes of the Pope would have to be argued by other means, but all we would have to prove is that there was indeed a bishop in Rome within the 1st century of Christianity. But this is where the second issue comes in, and that would be that Protestants would likely point out that Ignatius's writings don't prove that there was only one main central bishop in Rome. Just because an ideal church has at least one bishop, it could be the case that there were multiple bishops in Rome. Therefore, no primacy was just given only to one. Therefore, the idea of the papacy is at very least unsubstantiated. What we need to show is that Ignatius believed in the Monepiscopacy. That is, that he believed a central bishop would rule over a certain area and not be coordinated by a committee of bishops. As far as the Protestant is concerned, there could be several bishops at the Church of Rome and not just one leader whom we would later attribute as being the Pope. This is what I see many Catholics overlooking and also what many Protestants are searching for and contending on. Thankfully, we can actually see Ignatius's opinion on this in his writings elsewhere. He writes, "So that you obey the bishop and the presbytery with an undivided mind." Notice that in this writing and also the previous one, he doesn't cite multiple bishops, but he does cite multiple presbyters. He only talks about a single bishop, which they are to obey. This would show Ignatius being in support of the Monepiscopacy, the idea that an area or church would only have one bishop, not multiple bishops. This isn't just about specific instances, since we can see this as a trend in his writings. He goes on to write, "So neither do anything without the bishop and presbyters," also citing only one bishop. "It is therefore necessary that, as you indeed do, so without the bishop you should do nothing, but should also be subject to the presbytery as to the apostle of Jesus Christ." But to really show that this isn't a coincidence in any means, we actually have a very defined teaching in his epistle to the Philadelphians. "Take heed then to have but one Eucharist, for there is one flesh of our Lord Jesus Christ, and one cup to the unity of his blood, one altar, as there is one bishop, along with the presbytery and deacons. Just as there is one Eucharist and one flesh of our Lord Jesus Christ and one altar, there is also one bishop. However, there are multiple presbyters and deacons. This shows that the idea of having only one bishop is central to Ignatius's emphasis. And if he is writing to Rome, which is a worthy and ideal church, made an example to everyone, then that church in Rome doesn't at least have only one bishop, it has exactly one bishop, a Monepiscopacy of Rome, of whom they submit to. As we can see in his writings, it is manifest, therefore, that we should look upon the bishop even as we would upon the Lord himself. Give heed to the bishop, that God may also give heed to you. My soul be for theirs that are submissive to the bishop, to the presbyters, and to the deacons." This emphasis is actually very similar to what is written in Hebrews. "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls and will give an account." So although not explicitly, Ignatius's writings are an early 2nd century evidence and testimony of a single bishop of Rome presiding within the 1st century of Christianity. If you want more Catholic apologetics, be sure to like and subscribe and stay tuned for our future videos. But until next time, thank you all for watching.